Welcome to the Just the Right Snowboard channel. I am Lars Horstman, and if I don't screw this one up entirely, this episode might well become the ultimate timeless guide to picking the right snowboard. Let's face it, the market is oversaturated and there's way too many snowboards to choose from. It takes a lot of experience to make a good choice, and it's actually really hard to find good advice. We are mostly relying on 5-star reviews given by people who are giving the 5 stars because the board shipped in time. And of course, that doesn't really help us. What does help us is understanding a spec sheet, for example. This is that little sheet with all those numbers that you find on a manufacturer's homepage. And many of those numbers can be confusing, and I'm going to try to shed some light into the dark. But before we go there, we have to actually limit ourselves with a couple targeted questions. Take a good look in the mirror before you take a good look at all those different snowboards out there. With a couple little questions, you can really narrow it down, and you don't have to look at all the offering, but really only what works for you in the first place. And some of those questions would be, how often do you actually ride? Like, if you are someone who rides 5 days a year, you probably don't want a board that is ultimately specific and can only do one particular thing. Your ability level is of importance. If you are a beginner, don't buy a pro model for $1,000 with all the carbon and extra stiffness. Then you need to figure out what kind of style you're after. Are you prioritizing freestyle or free ride or carving or deep powder? Do you maybe already have a snowboard or two and you're just adding to the quiver? Or does it have to be one board that does it all? So with those questions answered honestly to yourself, you will already be able to narrow it down quite a bit. The next thing takes us straight to spec sheet numbers, and I want to talk about waist width. Waist width is such a crucial thing, first of all for the performance of your board and the ease of your ride, the effortlessness, but also because so many boards aren't offered in the width that you need, in particular if you are a big-footed person. And with that in mind, you can really filter through so many boards right away by simply figuring out the waist width you really need. And if that is something maybe on the particularly large or particularly narrow side, you will be very quick finding the right snowboard. Or if you are unlucky, ending up having to get a custom board, which is quite often the case for people with a size 13 foot or something like that. So waist width, what's the appropriate waist width? It's a pretty simple thing if you want just an easy rule of thumb. I have videos, I will be putting lots of videos into the video description here today that dive deeply into all the subtopics. If I pick all that up here today, that'll be a 3-hour talk, and that's way too crazy. The videos are already there, they'll be in the video description. So I have a video on how to find your right boot size, and that also eventually leads to the waist width question. Considering you are in the right boot size, what's a good boot fit? First of all, real quick, if you are standing up straight with your knees locked out in your snowboard boot, properly laced up, and you are not touching the front, that boot is likely too big. You want to be touching the front in a way that is like, little uncomfortable, and as soon as you actually flex your knees and ankles into a riding position, pushing your shins into the tongue of your boot, that contact, toe against the end of the shell of your boot, should be gone, and that would be a pretty good performance fit. Now with that in mind, take a look at your foot length. Measure your foot in centimeters. That's your mondo point size. I measure 28 centimeters or 280 millimeters, however you want to put it. And waist widths are obviously stated in millimeters or centimeters. So with my 28 cms, I go, and if I want an all mountain ride that has a functional waist width and takes me everywhere and isn't hard to get on edge, but also I might boot out occasionally, I can subtract about 15 millimeters from my measured Mondo Point foot size, and that will leave me with a 265 millimeter waist. So a board with anything under a 265 mil waist is probably, you know, 260 might just about work, but I really shouldn't go below that. With that in mind, I can already narrow it down big time. Quick but necessary interruption. If you like what you are seeing on this channel and I have actually helped you with my content and you think that I deserve your monetary support, you can do this entirely subscription free and voluntarily on a little tipping platform called buymeacoffee.com. My link there is buymeacoffee.com/justaride, and you can tip me in form of a symbolic coffee. And many people have done this last season, and that has helped me tremendously to get through that season, and I am very much appreciating that kind of support. It's necessary for me to talk about this here and get you to chime in that tip jar, because I am basically unsupported. I'm doing this in my free time, and yeah, you can imagine it takes a lot of time to create this content and share it here with you. All right, hopefully you like what you're seeing. Hopefully you're going to support me there, and let's dive deeper into board specs so that you can find your perfect board without anybody else's advice but some spec sheets. If I'm not aiming for an all mountain ride, but maybe for a carving specific board, then considering my riding level, I might not want to deduct anything. So I just take my foot length, 28 centimeters, and I make that my waist width. That would leave me with a board that I probably cannot boot out on at all. I don't pick my boards that way. I want them to be a bit more functional. Therefore, watch my video on functional waist width and also on carving waist width. It's all already on my channel. I pick my boards a little narrower than that, even the carving ones. My widest one is 275 waist, and again, foot measures 280, so it's 5 millimeters less. But even on a 270 waist, for the very most part, I am fine. So for everyone who isn't aiming for ultra high edge angles out there, you are likely fine picking a board that has a waist about 15 millimeters narrower than what your foot measures in centimeters. Now, I mentioned this in other videos here. Waist width is actually quite misleading, or can be misleading, because what really matters is the underfoot width, because the board obviously changes in width as you go from the center outwards to the tips. It gets wider. And taper, for example, affects this, and the side cut depth of the board affects this as well. If you consider a board with a really deep side cut, meaning a tight turning radius, it grows much more towards the inserts than a board with a very shallow side cut, right? And then taper, for example, if the tail is narrower than the nose, then naturally the board doesn't flare out quite as much towards the tail. So how can you determine if the manufacturer doesn't give you the information of underfoot width, what the board would possibly be under your back foot? You can, as a rule of thumb, you can say if the board is not tapered and doesn't have any kind of crazy radius, and what I'm talking about here is like anything between, let's say, 7.5 and 8.5 meters of a turning radius. That's the majority of boards out there. You should be able to get to the underfoot width by simply adding about 10 to 12 millimeters to the waist. So if you have a 260 millimeter waist on a given board that is otherwise pretty standard, you should be about 272 under the back foot. And how does that relate to your foot size? In my case, I said I'm a 280 foot length, and if I take a 270 board and I add like about 1 centimeter, then it's 280 under the foot, and that would actually match my foot length. So if your foot length matches your underfoot width, that's definitely a go. Like, you don't have to worry about too much boot out there, and the board is still going to be, you know, easy enough to get on edge. Now, this is all a little bit relative. If you are not after any kind of high performance carving, then you can or even should go a little bit narrower than this suggestion. That will make life much easier in choppy conditions or in bumpy conditions. However, if you are after the ultimate carve, then you could actually go a little bit wider than this. Of course, this also changes with the footprint of your boot. Even if your boots fit the way I described, and they're not too big, you might be in a boot that is naturally just bigger, like more material on the boot. So I don't know about these little variables. And this is just supposed to be a pretty darn good close guideline to pick the right board. Obviously, stance width messes with this as well. If you have a very narrow stance, the board doesn't get that much wider towards the tip and tail. Generally speaking, you want to think more about the back foot here than the front foot, because in about 100% of the cases, your back foot is mounted at a flatter angle than your front foot if they are not the same. Nobody rides with whatever 21 degrees on the front foot but 27 minus on the back foot. That doesn't happen, right? So your back foot is mostly the flatter angle, therefore you need to prioritize the width under the back foot, since that is the foot that you would likely be booting out on. Quick note on short fats, because surely somebody's going to ask, what about short fats? They are meant to be ridden shorter and therefore wider. I have a very strong opinion on this, and you can find this in my videos. I'll put one into the description here. Short fats are snowboards that have been shrunk in length but actually have excessive waist width, so you don't really lose any surface area, and what you get with that is a board that floats super well in powder due to that excessive width and steers extremely quickly due to the shrunk length. And that is wonderful in deep powder or for people with really, really big feet who can actually ride those boards in any condition all over the mountain if they want to. For everybody who is in a rather small boot or has rather short feet and is on one of those excessively wide boards, those boards will develop more leverage over your ankle than your foot has over the board, and therefore they will buck you around, and it'll be very exhausting to ride those in choppy, like everyday kind of conditions. It's going to be very, very hard on your ankles. The idea that the snowboarding industry says, but they have been shrunk, they are shorter, and therefore they are wider, and therefore you can ride it, makes absolutely no sense at all. Length and width are two different things. They have two different purposes, and people need to pick both appropriately unless they are buying a deep powder only board. This brings us to length and the next myth that needs to be busted. In the last 20 years, the mantra was you pick the right length by picking the board where you are in the rider weight range. So manufacturers state a weight range with every board and its length, and that weight range, which is also really funny when you really think about it, is mostly about 50 pounds. So from 150 to 200 pounds in this model, you should be on a 158. Let me tell you why that doesn't work that simply. Length is its own thing, right? More length, more stability. Calmer board at high speeds, more float, unless you go short fat, of course. And all these benefits of length, right? Mostly stability. Shortness, however, more agility. This is something you need to outweigh. Who are you? What are you going to do on that board? If you're in the park, well, you don't want a long board unless you're Zeb Powell and you're rocking some sort of 2-meter thing to just show that you can. Not that it's functional, but hey, he can. Why wouldn't he? Sorry, that was an opinion, wasn't it? So agility, right? Like you would prioritize shortness so you can spin quicker and the board is overall easier to handle. Now let's take this weight range thing into the equation. Here's your guy, 5'5" tall. He wants a park board. He's a little overweight. He's 220 pounds and he's looking at the weight range of his favorite twin, and the manufacturer says, well, 220 pounds, you gotta be on the longest one. That's the 162. Well, good luck, because that guy, being 5'5" tall, obviously also has shorter legs. Therefore, he's going to be rocking a narrower stance, relatively speaking. And now this little man that is a little overweight is rocking his narrow stance on a 162, and he's trying to spin that thing. That can't work, can it? Now you can take the other example. Guy is 6'4" and only weighs maybe 160 pounds, and he wants a free ride board, so he wants stability. What is stability? Stability in that case, this guy is huge, he has a very high center of mass. Any kind of fore-aft movement requires a fairly long nose and a fairly long tail because his center of mass is so high up. Now his 160 or 170 pounds will make the manufacturer suggest to buy the 157. It's not going to work. It's not that simple. We cannot disconnect the length discussion entirely from the weight discussion and be like, well, just pick the board by weight range. It's not going to lead to the best possible result. Let's take a look at that. So here we are on the Burton homepage, and I have had that good look in the mirror. I find myself to be a directional rider. I want something playful that still floats in powder. Therefore, I pick a board that has some taper to it. The Burton Counterbalance is new in the line and I'm pretty intrigued. It's a cool graphic and basically so far it ticks all my boxes. And yeah, now it's time to look at those spec sheets. And Burton are offering this find my size thing here, and that is pretty handy. They give me the Mondo Point option for boot size. I'm a 28. There you go. My weight is about 137 pounds. And find my size. And they are saying I should be on a 154 wide right here or a 154. Now, let's take a look what that means. Size chart right here. 154. It says 249 millimeter waist. So I said I need at the very minimum a 260, ideally a 265 for my all mountain waist width. When I go for the 154 wide, that leaves me with a 257. And at this point, this board is off my radar. I am no longer drooling over a nice graphic or whatever. I'm simply going to forget about it. And this is how you need to approach this. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself nuts. For me to wonder whether the 257 might actually work, but maybe if and that and this and with a different binding, maybe I can make it work. It's nonsense. Set your parameters, take that good look in the mirror, and then approach it very realistically, like a yay or nay kind of situation. And the 257 waist make this a no-go. Let's take a look at some other things here because it's interesting. Weight range. So this is why they are putting me on that board, right? Like 120 to 180. They are clearly prioritizing weight range over boot size. If they prioritized boot size, they would suggest 58 or maybe even 62 wide. Now let's take a look at this, 120 to 180. What does that mean? That is a 60-pound window. That sounds huge to me. And boards are obviously rated by their flex as well. So let's take a look at this guy. It is saying personality from soft to playful to stiff and aggressive. They are locating that board right here. And let's just make this a little bit easier to understand. Let's say this whole bar that we are seeing here, the personality bar, is a 1 to 10. That's a little bit easier. Then the center of my black section here is probably about a 7, right? So right where my mouse arrow is, that's my 7. So this 7 out of 10 is applies to a rider that is in the middle of this weight range window, and that would be a 150-pound kind of rider. If you are a 120-pound rider, this board is much likelier this end of the spectrum or even here. Now, does that mean that you can't or shouldn't ride the board? No, that does not mean that. This depends on your ability level and really what kind of board you can handle. Some people choose their boards purposefully like this. For me personally, I said this in a different episode, I ended up on boards that are more, let's go back to the size chart here, that are more like, 162 wide, because I always prioritized waist width, because the worst thing for me is booting out. It just means I cannot ride the way I want to ride, and I constantly have to be careful of like a component that I don't have much control over. Like the booting out happens quite suddenly and then you're on your face. So I prioritize waist width, and that has put me naturally on boards that are a little bit longer, and also I'm quite often out of the weight range, but with a good ability level that is not necessarily a problem. So anyhow, for you to understand, quite important, that weight range and stiffness rating are interconnected, and because of the large window that you find in the weight range, you can obviously, or have to obviously, consider that the stiffness rating is also a little bit of a sliding chart. Back in the 90s, weight range was not necessarily a big thing, and I think that is just as wrong as solely going by the old chin, mouth, eye size chart. And that was basically that anything to your chin is more of a freestyle length. It's short, it's nimble, it's agile, it spins fast. Then something around your mouth is more of an all-mountain kind of length, and up to your eyes or even forehead can be like a free ride, big mountain, fast speed riding, stable length. And I personally think the truth lies somewhere in between. I still go by this kind of chart or recommendation and then mix in the weight range. What that means is if I was to pick a 168 long freeride board, I wouldn't pick the crazy carbon loaded one. I would pick something that is a little bit mellower, if that even exists. But surely I shouldn't pick a board where the weight range starts at 200 pounds, right? So basically you want to look at both. If you want something stable, you have to get something longer. You can't get the stability that length will give you solely out of stiffness. I think that makes sense. If you take this example to the extremes and you put me on a 1.20 meter long snowboard, like a kit board that is brick stiff, that's not going to do, the stiffness is not going to do anything to make that thing stable, because the surface alone will simply like jitter around under me, right? It's not enough length. So consider both things when choosing the right length. The next thing you want to understand and factor in is the amount of taper a board has and the setback of the board. While setback can be altered, it basically just means, let me grab my cardboard example here again, whoops. Setback is basically you have your effective edge, that's the portion of your edge between the widest spots. You see those two lines here. So this is my effective edge, and the center, this is a true twin. Center of that effective edge is right here. Here are my inserts, and if I take my insert packs and move them 2 centimeters this way, so that's my tail, like I move the whole thing 2 centimeters back off the center here over the effective edge, then I've created a board with 2 centimeters or 20 millimeters of setback, and that makes the board more directional, right? It gives me more nose, less tail. It stiffens the tail a little bit, and it gives me more nose to float easier in powder and all that kind of stuff. So that's your setback, and then your taper is narrower tail than nose. And why would that have an effect on your pick? You can basically locate that on a chart between full freestyle and full free ride. The more you go into free ride and powder, the more likely it is that you actually want some taper and some setback, because both things help with float and powder and with the way the board turns and handles speed. Taper has two main effects. One thing is narrower tail, of course, kills some surface area on the tail and allows for the tail to sink much easier in deep snow. The other effect of taper is that a board with taper tends to finish its turns more down the fall line rather than steering properly across the hill. And that can be desired if you actually want to carry a lot of speed in kind of a stable manner. Then of course you want a board that doesn't overturn, let's just call it that. However, it can mess with you. For me, for example, here in Fernie, our hill is fairly steep, and I do tend to ride groomers with all of my boards, and on a steep groomer, a board that doesn't actually like steering across the hill overly much, tends to pick up too much speed to actually still control a clean carved turn, and that is something that I'm after, and therefore I have a personal preference on the amount of taper that is still functional for me. I would like to dive into some Jones boards that I pulled up here, because Jones offer us all kinds of cool measurements that we can explore and understand taper and setback and underfoot width and all this stuff. So I pulled up a couple of boards here, and I'm going to start with a twin like the Tweaker here. So that board, when you go into the size guide, oh, Jones have two things, size guide and also board specs. That's kind of unique. In the board specs, they are actually not talking about weight range. It's just other numbers. So this is literally your size guide, and they offer a 50-pound weight range. And yeah, when I look at a Tweaker here, what would that put me on? They would likely put me on a 151. That is not my liking. So, right, like you can see, people like myself, light end of the spectrum, but averagely tall, like I'm 5'9.5". Companies will always put me on something around a 150 or 154-ish or something, and I just find that too short. So 57 wide, 130, 180 pounds. I'm at the lower end of this weight range. So for me, their kind of stiffness rating would be amped up a bit. Like, let's take a look. Personality flex, mid-stiff, lively, 4 out of 5. So for me, this board would likely be a 5 out of 5. This is not the major thing I want to talk about. Let's go into the size guide here. This is really the interesting part. So what you see regarding setback and taper, you see here a very bottom setback 0. So you are in the center of the side cut, and taper is also 0. And what that means, let's take a look here at my cardboard twin again. What that means is on a board with a radial side cut that follows one single circular curve, and my board having no taper and me being centered over the effective edge, that I should come out with equal width under front foot and back foot. There should not be a difference. And when you look at this chart here, that is confirmed. Front foot width 25.4. I'm looking at the very first board here, the 146. Back foot, underfoot width also 25.4. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. This board is kind of as twinish as it can possibly be. The tip and tail length are also the same. So we are really looking at a true twin. And this board is therefore out of the race for me, because I don't want a true twin. I want something more directional. We're going to work ourselves up. Size guide of the Rally Cat. What is going on here? Sorry, not size guide. I want the board specs. Rally Cat. I'm going to stick to the first one here again, 151. This is not considering myself. I would pick it longer, but it's easier for you to read. What are we looking at here? We have a setback. Aha, 2 centimeters. So this is a bit more interesting for me. It's still no taper, so I don't want this board either. I want something with a bit of taper. However, what do we get here? Tip and tail length. Aha, it's 1 centimeter difference. The tip is 1 centimeter longer than the tail. no taper. So you're looking at a board that is basically, you can call this a directional twin. You are very moderately set back 2 centimeters. You have a tiny bit more nose than tail, and therefore that's your directional twin. Same story here, I want taper. The width under the feet changes. That is an interesting one for you to understand, and that really makes clear board geometry. So under the front foot, 25.6, under the back foot, 25.9. Why is it wider under the back foot? Because, let's take a look at cardboard here again, because let's say my rally cat is this board here, and we just add a centimeter more nose, right? And now Jones went and moved the stands 2 centimeters back. Everything else is fully symmetrical. What happened? Under the front foot, the board got narrower. Under the back foot, the board got wider, right? So this is how setback alters the underfoot width. And in particular, when there's no taper present, as on the rally cat, the board, as you move it further back, becomes wider and wider under the back foot and narrower under the front foot. All right, interesting thing to follow through the board examples here. Then I am looking at a board actually that I'm really curious to ride. This is a Jones Frontier, and this board got heavily overworked, redesigned, revamped. Let's take a look at the board specs. So we're going to go with a 150 here, the first column again. Insert setback 2 centimeters, and then I have 5 millimeter taper. This is stated in centimeters. This is clearly not the case. They mean millimeters for sure. So 5 mil taper, that's pretty cool. 5 mil taper, I think, is barely noticeable. Like, you will probably not notice it riding switch very much. Combined with 2 centimeters setback, you may notice it a little bit, and you will probably just about notice it in powder. However, the power performance of this board, you would notice that much more due to the different tip and tail length, right? You are looking at 24.1 tip length, 17.6 tail length. So very directional board. This is kind of my vibe, right? I want more nose than tail, I want some setback, and I want some taper. Now, here is interesting that you have equal width under the feet again. How can that be when the board is actually set back? Well, that is because it's tapered. They moved the stance inserts 2 centimeters back, but because the tail of the board is 5 millimeters narrower, it doesn't grow that much as you move towards the tail. So therefore, there's a very good chance that with 2 centimeter setback and 5 millimeter taper, you are ending up with equal width under each foot. And when you watch my video on taper, this is an indicator, if this is a radial side cut, that you are actually standing in the center of the side cut while standing a little set back over the effective edge. And this is a very, very desirable position to be in, because then when you ride switch, you will notice that taper even less because you're in the center of your turning radius of your side cut. I like a lot of things about this board. Also, I like about this board that it's rated soft and playful, so that's a 2 out of 5. And if I then look at an appropriate waist width for myself, I am looking at a 27.1 in the last column here on the 167. Now, if I go into the size guide, 167, here it is. They're saying it's 170 to 220 pounds. And for this kind of rider, this board is a 2 out of 5 flex. Now, for me, this would probably be more of a 4 out of 5 flex. I'm just theorizing here, right? But that means that I could potentially ride this board to fit my large feet with my very light weight. And this is the kind of equation that I was hinting at earlier when I said length and weight range need to be considered together. What a guy like me needs to do in a case like this, depending on ability level of course, is to find this kind of board that is naturally a softer flexing design, and then I can actually pick my desired length. All right, next thing up here, Hovercraft. We are looking at even more directional. Let's take a look here. So Hovercraft is stands setback is 0. That's interesting. I'm not sure that this is correct. I'd be surprised. Taper 17 mil, however. So right, like you see these numbers, they mean something, right? Like you got 17 millimeters taper. Look at this thing again, how much nose there is. So where my mouse arrow is, that's my contact point of the nose, the widest spot. This is all just here to lift me up in the deep stuff. And then tail, widest spot is here. There's nothing, right? There's no tail at all. So this thing will really sink super, super easily. Yeah, total power board, right? Like it does actually really well on groomers. I'm not sure about the new design, but the old Hovercraft were great carving boards as well. So yeah, like what you see here is like I'm moving more and more into directional boards. Now when we are looking at the carving board here, the Freecarver 9000, I've ridden one in a 156 last year. There's some other things to note here. So taper 9 is again centimeters, it should be millimeters. Radius is 9 meters, so you're looking at a board that is larger turning. I said 7.5 to 8.5 meter turn radius is something that is pretty average these days. Everything past 8.5 basically means larger turn radius. And what does that mean for you? It means stability at speed. Basically, radius is it has a lot to do with your speed, but also with your ability level. You can think of it very, very easily this way. A board with a very tight side cut with a short turn radius will turn a lot with very little input. So if, for example, your riding level doesn't allow you to tilt a board high on edge, yet you want to get like a turny, agile feel, you should pick a board with a particularly short turn radius. What is that? That sounds like it's great for everyone, right? What's the downside of this? The downside is if you do have the ability to actually tilt that thing higher on edge, tilting a board higher on edge will make you bend it more, and that in return will tighten the turn radius, right? Now, if you have a board that comes with a 6.80 meter turn radius, and you have the ability to tilt that thing high on edge, and that is how you ride, you will end up making turns that are no more than 3 meter radius. And you can imagine that has a huge effect on the speed you can go. You cannot ride very fast if your turns are 3 meters in radius, right? What will happen if you do ride too fast for that kind of board is that you constantly like chatter out of the side cut, right? Like so, pairing a rider of a high ability level that wants to ride fast in steep terrain with a board that has a very tight side cut radius is not a good idea, and vice versa. If I put your beginner who had just started to get some edge control and to follow the side cut cleanly, like tilting the board on edge and then letting it ride its way, and I put that person on a 10 meter radius board, they will tilt it over a little and the board almost goes straight, right? Like it needs to be tilted high on edge in order for you to push into it and tighten the turn. If you don't do that, that thing's just going to take you for a ride straight down the fall line in a massive arc, right? So you don't really want that, and that is something to consider when you dive deeper into this spec sheet thing after you've found a good length, the good board overall with the right width and everything, and then you're like, well, I have 3 left on my chart that I'm interested in. Then you can start looking at stuff like sidecut and be like, All right, this is 9 meters. More, maybe that's a bit big for my ability level or the terrain I ride or the desired outcome. If you want a particularly agile board, 9 meters is not that agile, to be honest. It's a fast board, right? And that is where it shines. So we talked about the right waist width and underfoot width, the right length, the right stiffness according to your weight and ability level. We talked about radius, how that affects the board. We talked about taper. If you truly understand these things, you're gonna find a board that will 90% be the right choice if you pick with these things in mind. If you did want to go deeper down this rabbit hole and there's more numbers in a spec sheet, you'd be talking about contact length, effective edge length. You could factor in reference stance. That's actually a pretty simple one, and that's not such a dumb idea to figure out. Recently I've heard from more people that they find boards often come with too wide of a stance. They can't get their correct stance setup with their desired setback in their stance width on a given board. So as an example, let's say we are looking at, like, I don't know, let's say 58 centimeters. That's like what, close to 23 inches in the center here. And you are like normally riding 52 on a board that doesn't have a channel and like a Burton channel. The increments here are 2 centimeters, right? So if I move both together from 58, I move them 2 inwards, both of them, I'm coming out at 54. So if I'm used to riding 52, then on this board, I cannot actually achieve that. That is a problem, or used to be over the last years, in particular with Ride and K2. They kind of stuck to this very wide stance kind of thing. Jones had that as well in some of the boards, I believe, but from a Good Ride review, James Beastie, hi James, I heard that on some of the boards they actually changed that. I think on the Frontier that I mentioned here, that has actually changed. Anyways, that's your stance width, your reference stance thing. Reference stance stated in a spec sheet also determines the setback location. So when those two are basically intertwined. If a manufacturer tells you 2 centimeter setback, that counts for the position at the reference marks. Whatever you alter from there will change the setback potentially. Okay, well, let's just complete this thing. Jones are giving you something like surface area. That's the second row here. Personally, I think you can quite happily look over or look past surface area. It's a powder thing, right? Like the surface of the board, how well does it float? Unless you pick a board solely for deep power performance, and then you are likely quickly in shapes that indicate this kind of use. And therefore they will have adequate surface area. So yeah, you can factor this in, but I never do. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. Contact length. This is an interesting thing to understand, effective edge versus contact length. Let's look at my cardboard here again. So basically, effective edge, I said it earlier, is the amount of edge between the widest points. Why is the contact length shorter? The contact length is supposed to be the base contact length. So if I have a board with a bit of tip and tail rocker, and this tip and tail rocker is starting inside of my effective edge, then this amount of base here is obviously shorter than the portion of my effective edge that is touching the snow. And anything length related, whether it's the overall length or the contact length or the effective edge length, can be taken as a stability versus agility equation. If your effective edge is shorter, the board will be easier to get off edge, as in you're carving and you need to slam on the brakes or speed check. That'll be much easier with a board with a short effective edge. However, a longer effective edge will give you more grip. Contact length and effective edge do play together in a way. Don't know whether this is still so important because boards are no longer rockered or purely rockered, like full-on banana. That's not really a thing anymore. Not sure who still does that. But you could of course say, well, a full banana board, when the rider is standing on it, literally the contact length ends right past the bindings, right? That thing wants to be in its banana arc. I'm going to weight it down when I stand on it, but right past the bindings, it's lifting up. So if I had a board that is 2 meters long with a 170 centimeter effective edge, but it's full rocker, my contact length is probably only going to be 60 centimeters. And therefore, the board would still be quite swivelly when it's on its flat base, and my effective edge would only have an effect once I tilt that thing on edge properly, right? So effective edge, contact length do play together. I am personally not bothered with contact length whatsoever, because my mantra is I ride my board on edge. I want to turn on edge, and you know, I'm not kind of like a put it on the flat base and bomb down the hill kind of rider. If that is how you ride, you don't turn, then yeah, pick a longer board, ideally full camber. Then contact length and effective edge should be almost the same thing, and that's probably going to be your happy place, your maximum stability place. I want to make 2 more comments here on taper and on sidecut radius regarding spec sheets. Therefore, I'm going to pull up a K2 board here. So K2, this is the Commonwealth. K2 don't state taper as a single number. What they tell you is board width. And in a case like this, let's take a look at the first row here. It's the 146. You see tip, waist, and tail width. Actually, they call it trail width. Little typo. You see 28.8 in the tip, 24.3 at the waist, 28 in the tail. Now, this tells you the taper. Taper is 8 mil. Once you subtract the tail from the tip, you are left with 8 millimeters, and that's your taper, right? So if a spec sheet doesn't state taper, it will very likely state tip and tail width, and that gives you the taper. And then there's something interesting here with sidecut. Ideally, you know, for your understanding, it's ideal if the sidecut is a single number. However, this is rarely the case. What that means in real life is basically just that the curve that you see, the outline of your board, the radius, is a blend out of multiple different radii that then get basically blended together, so there is no like disruption. So a multi-radial sidecut has nothing and absolutely nothing to do with serrated edge design, like on a Liptech board, the banana thing. This is not the same thing as sidecut, okay? This is an important thing to understand. A multi-radial sidecut, like on this K2 Commonwealth, will still show as one continuous, at least continuous looking curve along your board, because it's so finely blended. And what we see in case of the Commonwealth is basically a board that has tighter tip and tail radii than the center. So what that means is that basically the board, you could probably translate this to a behavior, a personality that is like very easy to turn and quite snappy to exit turns with. Because the tip radius very much defines the turn entry radius, because you want to weight your front foot to enter turns, and therefore the first thing you engage of the board is the tip radius. And making that a little bit shorter assists with getting into turns, because at the beginning of your turn you don't have your board very high on edge, and therefore you're not bending it very much, and it's not necessarily turning very much. So a very tight tip radius in the nose helps with getting into a turn. And then K2 mellow that out quite dramatically into a 7.30 m. I'm talking about the 1.46 m first row here. 7.30 m in the center, and then exit radius is 480. And what that means is as an advanced rider, you should be, or intermediate rider even, you should try to start your turns on the front foot, finish them on the back foot. And in this case, that would help with turn exit, right? It's kind of like a snappy, poppy turn exit with this quite tight tail radius that is on this board. Now, what we don't know, and that's also somewhat irrelevant for you to understand, it's too deep of a rabbit hole, is how long these sections are. You could basically, back to the cardboard, you could probably assume that on some of these boards, let's just take this one here, relatively speaking, like that's obviously a very short effective edge, that these sections where the side cut blends into something shorter is no more than like 10 to 15 centimeters worth of your overall edge. So basically, it's the manufacturer trying to simply change the personality of the board mildly with those little tweaks, right? So that's something to understand and to not over-interpret. I feel like this is probably the very last thing that anybody wants to look into, and at that level of understanding and riding, you will very most likely already know and feel out for yourself what you really want and what you really like. Like, for example, this is its very own rabbit hole in carving world. It's the side cut thing is quite important. Donic, I forgot how they call it, something variable, side cut, something. Prioritize a side cut. Actually, Korua do this, or used to do this as well, where the radius gets larger towards the tail. And the idea there is that basically as you tilt your board on edge and enter the turn, so you have a slightly tighter turn entry radius that assists with getting into it. And then from then onwards, you will tilt the board higher and higher on edge. And that, of course, tightens the radius more and more and more, therefore making the board's actual side cut larger towards the tail. It corresponds with your amount of angulation through the turn, and you should end up with a pretty symmetrical round turn shape, or although the board's side cut is not a clean single radius. If that makes any sense, this is a rabbit hole, and yeah, that will likely be its own episode. But this is just the details of this kind of stuff that I don't think are important for you to understand for the majority of riders out there when they pick their boards. What you want to know regarding side cut and taper is what it overall does, right? Like small number for side cut radius, very easy, very quickly responding board that has a speed limit. It becomes too nervous when you go fast and tilt it on edge. You're going to blow out of the side cut. The opposite counts for the large number for side cut radius. And taper, the larger the number of taper, like 20 millimeter plus, is clearly indicating power board, power performance, much less surface area in the tail, easy to sink the tail. Therefore, the board on hard snow will likely tend to draw a straighter arc, like it's not going to turn across the hill all that much, making it more difficult for you to scrap speed in like a carving environment and so forth. And then obviously with taper, I don't think I said this earlier, I thought that was obvious, taper of any kind will make the board asymmetrical of sorts and kill the twin performance, the switch riding performance to a degree, right? Like I want to say an experienced rider can ride switch without knowing much of a difference, probably up to 15 millimeters taper. I feel like I can somewhat safely say that. You will notice it, but it's not going to bug you. If you only just started to ride switch, any taper is probably going to bug you a bit. Like maybe 2-3 mil, you won't know, but 5 millimeters to 10-15 millimeters, you would probably know that something feels a bit weird because you don't have the feeling yet to ride in the wrong direction, your not natural direction. And therefore any asymmetry, like standing more on the tail plus the narrower tail, will probably throw you off a little. Will it kill the fun factor of the board? No, because you're simply going to get used to it and probably adjust. Like I learned to ride switch on a fairly heavily directional board in a positive stance. So really it's like at the end of the day, you're going to get used to anything. But if you have that good, honest look in the mirror that I spoke about at the beginning of this episode, and you know already switch is like 50% of the time, well, don't bother with taper. Just buy something that has the same tip and tail width. And with this is why I said you need to have this conversation with yourself before you throw yourself into the market. Because with these kinds of criteria that only you will know, you can already eliminate so many boards and it will make your pick so much easier and more efficient. I think this kind of approach should help you to eliminate a whole bunch of boards and hopefully leave you with no more than 2 or 3 on the table that are really relevant for you. And then it is a matter of experience, pulling the trigger on something. You know, at that point you can probably go by the nicest graphic and just go for it and figure it out and learn with every board you may ever own or may ever get to ride. Demo events are extremely helpful. Unfortunately, they are not to be found on every corner. But yeah, if you can attend a demo event, go there and try some boards. The best thing and the one thing that nobody, not even myself, can argue with is your experience on snow. Are you having fun? Is it working for you? Who am I to say it's the wrong board? So go for that. I personally find this subject extremely difficult because it's so complex. Every aspect of board design plays into the other, and it's so hard to boil this down to like an understandable video that is actually helpful. So therefore, please let me know in the comments whether this was helpful and what I've been missing and what kind of other questions I might have produced here. Maybe we can turn this into a bit of a community chat and you guys can help each other with answering people's questions. Would be fun to read all that. Yeah, and otherwise, I hope that you are liking what you're seeing on this platform, and I'd be stoked if you liked the video, if you actually did, and subscribed and ring that bell for the notifications so you know what's coming up next. I'm gonna try my best to fill this winter 25-26 with more interesting content, and I hope that I can welcome all of you here for every episode. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.